And welcome back to Coast. Bob Fletcher back with us, a multifaceted entrepreneur, international consultant, manufacturer, merging a small toy manufacturing business back in 1985 with a corporation that turned out to be a supplier of weapons for the U.S. intelligence agencies worldwide, involving the highest levels of covert operations. Now, the merger placed Bob in a position of becoming a federal witness and led to him permanently becoming an investigative researcher as well, chasing corruption and all kinds of things. Bob, what a career. Welcome back.
Oh, wow. And that was like just the second half of my life. The first half was even equally as exciting. Well, almost as exciting anyhow. I had been like my old friend Sonny Bono. I had been the promotion director, manager, etc. for MCA in London and ABC Records in the earlier part of my life.
Right.
Which was an exciting career. But when I started manufacturing my own interesting toy, I merged it with a company that, son of a gun, that sure turned my life around. It turned out to be a huge shell company operation for the Central Intelligence.
Oh, jeez.
Carrying on all the secret covert wars and all that stuff around, and they tried to turn me into a James Bond, for crying out loud. And that was an extraordinary turn of events for myself.
What did they want with a toy company, Bob?
Well, they were using,
fronts?
To my surprise, they've done it for a long time, and that is the covert operatives utilize standard businesses that are non-suspicious for travel among different foreign countries and all of that, strictly as a covert front, and, of course, a money laundering situation. And I was right in the middle of the Iran-Contra mess, and, of course, I ended up testifying and supplying, being a sworn witness, a whistleblower, and supplied information about a whole multitude of facets to the Iran-Contra mess. And, of course, that was primarily a combination of super high-level intelligence operations, drug smuggling, and weapons sales of weapons globally. These characters were, well, it's all the same group of guys. And later on, as I really got into it, it's this same handful of guys that are ready at a phone call to supply weapons, supply military training, train mercenaries, and all of that
to anybody who pays.
And it's always the same people. It's amazing. But anyhow, that was the start of a change of my life. First off, I was overwhelmed that these radical criminal type activities taking place out of my toy factory, for one thing, with meetings with military generals and all of that, but and they were selling, supplying and setting up the shipping of Hellfire missiles and whatever.
Incredible.
So it was rather a change of life, but the amazing thing was it shocked me into realizing how much criminality was going on out of our government. Once I had testified and pursued, again, because they interfaced with so many things, several congressional and senatorial investigations were underway in a million directions during the 90s, and that's when it was. And I ended up being involved in terms of supplying witness information and what have you. But then I started doing investigations and ended up turning huge amount of documentation on all these crazy events and actions and what have you to many congressional and Senate investigations. And it got to be where when they wanted to see if they could fill in something in one of their puzzles, they would call Bob Fletcher. And I ended up eventually even running for the United States Congress in Florida, running against a guy who was a criminal congressman seated, and I actually did very good. I was like within 9 percentage points.
You got close.
Setting the apple cart. But anyhow, that was in reality. That's how it started, and I found out that they had been doing it all the time for years, and probably still are, with taking over small companies. They merge them in.
Did they approach you, or did you approach them?
Well, what happened with it? Actually, I was at a huge marketing company. We were based out of Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. Good market.
I went to a huge marketing show in New York City, and it was like 30,000 people there. One of those types of things in a multitude of different enterprises.
Yeah.
And this fella gave me his business card and said, that he had this huge operation selling material goods to the 7-Eleven stores, convenience stores, and he wanted to buy thousands of my products that I was manufacturing, which was a novelty-oriented material goods, and so that was great. I just took his card and ran him off, and then later on followed up. When I followed up on the address, lo and behold, this guy was located across the street from me in Atlanta. So it was obvious he was chasing me ahead of time.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
They had their eyes on you.
And the reason for that, I found out later, was 2 years prior to having my toy manufacturing company, I had an international consulting company, and my partner was the partner in the Consulate General for the country of Liberia out of Washington. So apparently that was the thing. Between having location right next to me, I guess it looked like an easy mark. And they did end up, not only I ended up merging my company before, I had no way of knowing what this guy was doing. And his name was Gary Best. And he's still doing it, to my surprise. I thought he had been killed a couple of years ago because he was doing cooperative, what do they call, double agent activities in Russia and everything else. He was really heavy duty.
Well, how in the world did you get involved with Nibiru and work like that?
Well, and what happened, again, because I had done a whole bunch of investigations at the Congressional and Senate level, and I had done stuff with, as a matter of fact, Sonny Bono later on, but someone had contacted me and wanted me to look into the missing multitudes of huge amounts of money. And I had already previously done several investigations chasing millions of dollars with an M, but this fellow said there was billions and trillions vanishing at a very high level in our government, and might I look into it? And I said, well, yeah, okay, sure, and blah, blah. And so I started looking at the money disappearing, and that ended up leading me to the amount of underground facilities that were being built around the globe, but of course, 100 of them here in America.
Then you're saying, I wonder what these are for.
That's right, and the point was that those were great places and the reason for all the vanishing money, but it spun off from that was, why would this happen? Why would also foreign nations be doing the same kind of underground facilities? And then it led to a couple of people that said, have you looked into Planet X or Nibiru? Because if it's returning, that obviously was a good reason for the elite New World Order crowd to have abilities to disappear underground if they had to. So that was how I ended up getting into Nibiru. Originally, I was skeptical. I didn't know much about it. I don't like to get into things without knowing what I'm talking about. So I spent quite a bit of time researching it and crossed paths with a lot of people, and the reality of how the Nibiru thing became much more realistic than it commonly might be, other than being a rumor that was talked about on talk shows,
Well, I got to tell you, we're getting close, according to some. Now, do you tie in at all, Bob, to this September 23rd prophetic date that they keep talking about?
Well, dating it, I did the DVD, this expose called Incoming, which we talked about when I was on your program last time, which has been quite
year.
A while.
Yeah.
And, it's really hard to do specific dates. And if you doing the research that I did, which was really extensive, and I was doing it off of the backs of guys that have actually been into this for much longer than I had, and it always came all of the ancient writings on this thing, including drawings on the cave walls and this sky disk that was discovered in Germany that was a couple thousand years old that actually dated and described the event of this huge planet crossing our paths and going around the sun. And then, of course, all the biblical writings, all the same, and the Chinese emperor many years ago, his people tracked it and actually saw it and tracked it day by day. But most of them all seem to indicate, in fact, that this took place during like March and April of the years that it did come by, and that the first sightings was usually in December, where people around the globe were spotting it as a new star, in the sky, and then coming and becoming closer. So the dates, I've pretty much convinced from all of those ancient writings, just like the Halley's Comet that comes around every 75 years, and you can pretty much mark the calendar, doesn't miss by much time at all, in being the same time. My feeling is that it probably will repeat itself and be first seen sometime around December. And then January, February, March, it gets closer, and then making its run around the sun, and that's the period of time, obviously, when it causes the greatest effect. But in my DVD, Incoming, I clearly explained and spelled out all of this, and it included, I hate to use the words predicting, but I could foresee likely the timing being the same, and that it also would start. Now, I put that out it's been about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago when I did the Incoming DVD, and but I put in there that things that we should expect if, in fact, it was coming back, and by that I mean it's an unknown entity, et cetera, and you can call it what you want, but that when it started to come back, that we absolutely, number one, would see a change in the solar system, and number two, that it would start affecting the sun and all the planets, and we would see an increase in meteoric problems. We would see an increase in global changes.
More severe weather. Including
earthquake, and, of course, weather. And that the weather would change and start getting really crazy for a multitude of reasons and progressively get worse and worse. And what is interesting is that back in 1995, and I testified before the United States Senate subcommittee, the Intelligence Subcommittee, and I apparently had said something about weather control on an interview with the United Press International or somebody back at that time, and one of the senators on the committee kind of surprised me, sort of ambushed me by asking me about the statement I had made about weather control. So I'm kind of like debating against myself here. That is, at that early point in 95, I was the first person that publicly confronted the United States Senate Intelligence Committee with the fact that we were like bandits because we were utilizing advanced weather control back then, or had the ability to do it. And this particular senator, I was amazed because he's either was pulling my leg and making like he knew nothing about it, or he was one of the small, or not really small, I was going to say one of the many congressmen and senators that really don't know what's going on up there, because we had already signed a United Nations treaty saying that, and the verbiage in it actually was, now that the United States, Russia, and China had the ability to control the weather, manipulate the weather, and create earthquakes, that we have to sign a treaty of agreement saying, in fact, we will not use it as a weapon of war. Now, of course, treaties is like it promises.
Right. They're all made to be broken.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like foolishness, I guess. But that's the reality. And I already had done so much research on that. I had an entire package on weather control as a weapon. And so I'm kind of like, it's a conflicting conversation this evening, because it's either that I know it was correct with the weather as a weapon, and by the way, it's changed from back then. It was predominantly the seeding of clouds.
Just simply seeding. But
it's now changed to where it's electronic superheating of the atmosphere and the water, and doing it by doing alterations with laser-type weapons from triangulation of satellites. So it's very serious now. Red Chinese has it. The Russians have it. And I believe at this point, if we didn't think that Screwball in North Korea doesn't have the ability to fool with it a little bit, we would be making a mistake.
Do you think, Bob, with all these hurricanes that we're experiencing, and we hadn't had one in 10 or 11 years prior to this, and they just keep coming over and over again. Now there's Hurricane Maria, and who knows what's next.
Right. It's first off, I think, and I don't know. I think that it is, in fact, an effect of Nibiru coming in. I do believe that. Now, if it is not, then it is, in fact, weather wars. We are, in fact,
manipulation,
being manipulated weather, and again, it's really become a science. The Red Chinese, I think, have 3,500 personnel just working for their weather control operations.
Dedicated to just that.
Yes, right. And of course, the Russians, they've had it for a long time. Believe it or not, they were selling weather. If people needed rain over a given area a few years ago, the Russian government was doing very well at supplying it.
And then they go out and make it rain.
Right. And as far as the new part now, of course, being electronic, which is much more...
Hold on, Bob, right there at that point. Electronic weather manipulation. We'll talk about that. Bob Fletcher with us. His DVD is called Incoming, the only expose of the incoming of Nibiru. We are back talking about Planet X, Nibiru. Bob Fletcher with us. His website linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Bob, let's get back into this. Is this the same Nibiru, of course, that Zecharia Sitchin has written about, the 3,600-year elliptical orbit Nibiru?
Absolutely, as far as I am concerned. Now, there had been a debate as to whether there had been an error back, many years ago, relative to the writing and the translations, as to whether it was, in fact, 3,000 years or 350 or 300 years.
I see.
And only one
big difference.
But was only one little misinterpreted writing back in the old the script would have made, again, that's right, you said it's just that one digit, but a misinformation or a misunderstanding of the digit would make it 3 instead of 35 or 3,000. It would have been 300. So there's kind of a debate, but nobody's been around since 300 years ago to verify it physically.
That's right.
Or 3,000. So we don't know. Now, I made an important point several times in the incoming DVD because we covered everything. I tried to cover.
And it's still available, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It
is.
And as a matter of fact, there's actually two others. There's a separate one on weather control that I had done quite a while back, where the spin-off from my testimony before the Senate, but and another one called Weapons of Mass Control, which also involves weather control a little bit, and then other strange electronics such as an aircraft that drags a unit behind it in the air and overrides radio programs and subconsciously implants signals and stuff. And we actually have live footage on that aircraft. That's a separate one. So there are actually 3 of them that fall in that category, 3 DVDs, and they're all still available on my website. But anyhow, I got sidetracked.
Well, we were talking about the orbit.
I interrupted myself there. So we're not positive, but it's a moot point whether it's 3,000 or 300. Again, I go so much by all of those old writings in terms of where everybody says, when is it going to be? Well, again, I think it's going to be seen as a star in December of the year that we're going to first see it. Now, whether that's this December or next or a few years down the road, it's hard to put a finger on that. But something that I made a point of several times in the DVD of Incoming, and that is that the United States government, just for us, just for America, they cannot permit people, first off, to find out about this. They cannot ever announce it. They can't come on and do a presidential thing and say, oh, by the way, in a couple of months, we may have the waters sucked right out of the ocean beds, like the Noah's floods or any of that. It's impossible because of, obviously, the amount of total panic that would be, global. So they can't even permit us to reach the December that it may start being seen by 10,000 amateur
astronomers. Sure.
Right. So, because for the first 1 or 2, and then there'll be 10, then it'll be 10,000. So what I'm saying is they would have to have or feel that they have as much control over the people as they can. Now, that means we must be into martial law in the United States before it's visible
happens
by a bunch of random people. It'll be visible by their satellites and telescopic satellites that they already have out there. They'll have a good vision of this thing. It is infrared. It was not easily seen, etc., until it reaches a point where it reflects our sun.
And it's bigger than the Earth, isn't it?
About 5 to 7 times, with about 5 moons are expected to be traveling with it.
Is it still inhabited, Bob? Sitchin believed it used to be.
I don't know anything about that. I've gotten no letters or emails from anybody up there, so that part of it's a little unknown. But the bottom line is, and that may, by the way, it may even have been, going by Sitchin's information, it may even actually have been one of the moons traveling with Nibiru that was actually physically habitated or had people on it. And again, that's something that you can read all you want, it's impossible to put your hand on it. But the bottom line is that I believe that when martial law is declared, it would be, obviously, I think a month or 2 prior to the December that it's visualized or going to be seen.
This is dramatic.
So now, here's the bottom line, of course. The stuff that's going on now, I believe, well, again, it's hard to tell whether this is being generated as a weapon of war by other people, or if it is, in fact, the effect of the incoming Nibiru. But I do know...
Or all of the above.
Or both of them. And that certainly is a possibility. But I do know that since I put out, a couple of years ago when I put out the incoming DVD, that I very specifically said, we got to watch the planets. All of the planets in the last year and a half to 2 years have had unusual effects taking place. They've had all the atmospheres of them have been the ones that have atmosphere that's measurable. Chemical changes in the storms that are on the different planets going all the way out to Pluto. There has been variations in the orbits, some of them very small, but nonetheless recognizable. The sun, in terms of the solar flares and the huge holes developing in the sun, they are in larger numbers. I also pointed out that we should expect increases in meteor showers. That is a fact taking place. I said probably the weather in general would be all screwed up for a lot of different reasons, but from the incoming of Nibiru, that is taking place. We know that. In the last year and a half to 2 years, the entire globe has been undergoing record-breaking, unusual, rare, and destructive weather.
All kinds.
Earthquakes, cracks in the earth, holes just popping up, right?
Wait till the volcanoes start, Bob.
Volcanoes have started. There's 45 to 50 of them blowing their tops today as we speak. It's not covered unless you get in there, and God bless you and the few other good talk programs that give us a little more news than you're going to get from the regular media. The media, I was told by a good friend of mine who was very, very high up in the Central Intelligence, used to write speeches for Bill Casey, all right, who was the head of the CIA
at the time, sure.
Reagan. And by the way, during Reagan's time was when my best understanding was that he was informed in '83 that Nibiru was real and it was headed back in. And that was the point in time when the money thing, the underground facilities started expanding, and all of the Star Wars stuff, they started doing all of that, but 80% of it was aimed out, away from the Earth, looking outwards, instead of what they said, looking towards Earth to keep track of rockets and what have you, nuclear problems and stuff. But that was a period of time when all of that changed. So anyhow, the changes on Earth,
and they're dramatic changes too, Bob. They're dramatic changes. They're not small. They're big. They sway.
And
back
I might
and forth.
mention something that's been I don't think anybody's talked about it at all. It's something that I discovered just a little while back. You know, down the East Coast in the Atlantic Ocean is a huge, like a figure 8 water flow beneath the ocean, and it goes all the way from the North Pole up there by the glaciers and what have you, the ice cap at the North Pole, and comes down, and it's in a huge, like I say, a figure 8. It comes all the way down like to near Miami, and then circles back around on itself just like a continuing flow of underground water. Now, the salt content has been completely altered in the Atlantic Ocean due to the melting of the glaciers and the ice cap. It's putting fresh water in to such volume that, in fact, it's altering the salt content, which changes the potential of our seasons and the storms, the development of storms, because of the difference of warm water, cold water, etc., creating low pressure, low points of where water can be drawn up into the sky, etc. and create these storms. So that's something nobody's talking much about, but it's a very realistic scientific event. Now, I would say whether we're talking just Nibiru's effects or we're talking the combination of bad guys fooling with the ocean, fooling with the existing storms and making them bigger, steering them. See, with highs and lows, we saw an unbelievable visual thing in Texas. When that storm came in through Texas, there was a huge low-pressure area to the east and a low-pressure area a high-pressure area to the east and a high-pressure area on the west. And it channeled and maintained that storm like going right down a bowling alley going into Texas. And these things are things that the manipulation of weather and the modification certainly can be done with the new electronics and the manner by which they're doing this now. So, again, like I say, I'm kind of getting into a debate between myself and me with whether, in fact, it's predominantly Nibiru, Planet X, or it's a combination or just...
And you might want to add also the possibility of some kind of weaponry doing it as a war type thing.
Well, and literally, that's what it amounts to. Now, the idea of weather control as a weapon of war, which was that treaty that I referred to that we signed around 1976-77 at the United Nations. We also had weather modification, a serious subcommittee on environment and atmosphere and scientific technology in October of 1977 at the Senate and Congressional level. We've had Claiborne Pell many years ago. Now we're talking even in the early 70s or late 60s. Senator Claiborne Pell came out and he simply said that the worst thing in the future was going to be weather wars and being applied by our enemies and ourselves at our enemies. And that was a whole thing that he had written up, a whole big movement he had going, and that was Senator Claiborne Pell in the 70s. Amazingly, George, I had somebody sent to me quite a while back a Life magazine of 1948.
Wow.
Where they were levitating solid mass and igniting fires and cutting or burning holes utilizing super ultrasonic high frequency sound waves. And it's the cover of the January 5, 1948 Life magazine. Is that amazing or what?
It is.
That's really a long time ago.
It sure is.
So when people talk about, they couldn't do it, and, only God can handle the weather, and so, I'm afraid we're fooling with some of God's works.
And you're right. I mean, the volcanoes, Mexico had a volcano the moment of the earthquake. Italy's got one going, and these are big, potential, huge
terrible.
earthquakes.
We have 7.1
volcanoes
in Mexico, and and by the way, the volcanic activity is done utilizing extreme low-frequency electronic vibrational generations in the Earth, causing movement of areas that may be likely where they have good faults, like Los Angeles.
Yeah, well, that's right, and the New Madrid fault that goes right through the Midwest.
Certainly, and that could be a gigantic. Well, any of them at this time. We've built these giant cities over top of so many of these faults. I mean, it's almost really stupidity, but because obviously we know when the Los Angeles big one hits, that's going to be just
devastating.
Something else. But and again, it's hard to judge which one is most likely, whether it's just the reaction of the incoming of a strange planetary intruder, or if in fact it's the weather wars.
Bob, is the world in chaos?
Not yet. I mean, of course, if you look at it, it certainly is.
It seems like it is.
With these combinations of, and we have the Korean problem. That's mind-boggling. That guy, is completely out of hand. My information is, which I mentioned briefly, that the likelihood of him, that character in North Korea, not having the same potential to affect the weather as a weapon, the chances of him not having them is not very likely, because he's been getting high-level assistance from Red China, and Red China's just eaten up with this, with their ability.
Oh, they've got. As a matter of fact, when they hosted the Olympics, they knew that they were going to manipulate the weather to stop it from raining or whatever they needed to do.
Good weather, they absolutely guaranteed it. And also, Russia, a few years ago, in Malaysia, they were suffering extreme smoke in Malaysia from huge, gigantic forest fires near the country, the Malaysian strip there. It's so bad that people were dying in the streets. You could not breathe. And they actually contracted with the Soviet Union to create and generate a cyclone or two to blow the smoke away.
And they did. Bob, stay with us. At the top of the hour, we're going to come back with your final hour, and we're going to take some phone calls as we talk about Nibiru, Planet X, a few more questions, and then your calls on Coast to Coast AM. This is our hour. We'll take your phone calls with Bob Fletcher as we talk about Nibiru, Planet X, incoming. That's his DVD. Fascinating work. He was on with me back in March of 2016 talking about this, and we're getting closer. Back in a moment. George Noory back with Bob Fletcher as we talk about Nibiru, Planet X. Bob, do you think Planet X might have been responsible for the flood of Noah?
Yes. Yeah, I do. Again, going by the multiple scriptures, including not just the Christian Bible, which would kind of indicate that was what took place, and of course it's written up in a few places where they refer to it as oh gosh, son of a gun, I can't think of the word. I'm just missing it out here right now. But it is implied and indicated in the Bible, and besides that, places like the monks on the top of the Himalayas, 500 years ago, and the the Chinese, when they had the emperor, had these all of these astronomers working for him, and they actually plotted it as it came by. As it approached and then came around, and then all the crazy effects of storms, and of course the biblical description besides Noah's flood, but the biblical descriptions of being killed by hailstorms, of burning stars falling down from the sky and things of that sort. And those all would be potentially events that would take place when Nibiru makes the journey around the sun and back out. Now, the scary part is, obviously what would take place as it comes in, it will pretty much take out all of our satellites, if for no other reason, strictly the electromagnetic pulse type of an effect it would have.
It's like detonating a nuke in the atmosphere.
Right, and additionally, what it will do, according to folks that are smarter on this than I am, as a matter of fact, is that they would it would probably take 155 days altogether. It would go around the sun. The first time passing around, we will go through its tail of debris, which would be an unbelievable meteor showers period of time. Pulverizing the earth with all that space junk that is dragging, millions of miles of it, and again comparing it to other meteoric type events. We would pass through it one time, then it will go around the sun and back out the other side, and in our regular run around revolving around the sun, we would go through it a second time. So the potential of extreme fires from burning debris and all that type of thing, it's almost unimaginable, besides the extraordinary flooding and all the rest of the problems that would come with it. The electromagnetic impulse problem would be another whole separate problem. So it would be a heck of a mess.
Sure would.
And the period of time people that are analyzing it, astronomers saying that it would be like a 150-day period of time between going through it once and then going through it a second time.
Bob, do you think people are acting strange and weird, and that Planet X could have something to do with it? Some kind of gravitational pull on them or something?
Well, I don't know. I don't. I used to be out on the road 300 days of the year doing lecture presentations on government corruption for many years, but then I haven't done that in quite a while, so I haven't been exposed to too many screwballs.
They're out there.
To give you an update. I don't know.
People are just acting strange.
2 years ago?
Yeah, it feels like it to me. Maybe when we get calls, we can pull some people, too. A lot of people just seem to be uptight lately.
Oh, well, of course, if they're uptight, they've got good reason. For those that are listening to the alternate media, they are getting the news that the regular media is intentionally not giving out. If you, like myself, of course, you're involved a little bit more than most people in terms of getting that alternate news media from a lot of directions.
Yeah. And
likewise in my situation where I pursue it probably more than the average person. But the news media is, we might as well not even have the regular news. In the old days, you had ABC, CBS, NBC, and we had reliable people. And I say the news was fairly good from the 1950s up until about 20 years ago.
And everybody watched Cronkite.
Yeah, all those guys, and they were trusted. And we did get the news as good as we could get it. Again, the younger folks right now can't imagine not having websites, web pages, and the World Wide Web to go to. But they have to realize that just a few years ago, back in the 70s, or even in the 80s, in 1983 or around in that period of time, that didn't exist. And we were utilizing, it was a big deal if you had a fax machine because you could communicate with people.
Yeah.
And when I started, I had interrupted myself a few minutes ago. I started to tell you an interesting story about this friend of mine that had been working with Bill Casey, the head of the CIA, with Ronald Reagan, and was very close, and like I said, actually wrote his speeches for him on most occasions. And it was a lady, and I asked her, because when I was living in L.A. like 20 years ago, for a few years, and we had this extraordinary bomb thing, a bomb guy with a big truck and a bomb supposedly filled with explosives, and of course they shut everything down, and they did this big media coverage. You had wires coming in through the windows and everything else, and it was a big deal in Los Angeles, but it went no place. It was on no other news.
Weird.
So I asked my friend in the CIA, I said, how did they do that? You can't control all that media, or how do they do it? And she said that a few years earlier they had finally succeeded in putting intelligence agents in the positions of management of, like UPI, United Press International, Associated Press, and the guys that threw the switches to notify other outlying television radio programs about important news. The guy that throws the switch, I guess, technically. And she said that they had controlled that for a few years, and yes, that they did have the ability to pretty much throw water. And, of course, this was before the internet.
Right. Social networking and everything else has changed all of that.
Right. But prior to that, they actually had the ability to just not throw the switch. You don't open the door, nobody's going to find out what's going on. And so they had terrific control of media at the very highest levels.
Do you see the conditions out there now that are getting more and more drastic? The weather conditions, storms are bigger. Everything's bigger. Yes,
well, it's mind-boggling. Yeah, and we're a point again. This is something that's not covered much at all by anybody. With the melting of both ice caps, the north and the south, all right, but particularly up north where they have glaciers that are melting like somebody's got a blowtorch on them. I mean, the melt is like nothing we've had in 1,000 years, and it's interesting, as you could say, like which I mentioned earlier, relative to changing the salt content of the entire ocean. But what's also happening? A couple of years ago, Miami reached a point that on high tide in Miami Beach, and I used to live there for many years, high tide in Miami Beach, every high tide it was coming in 6 blocks into the city and flooding the businesses. And Miami, the state of Florida, I think the number was, I don't know if it was $400 or $40 million worth of pumps that automatically have been going on in Miami Beach. This is before the hurricanes, had nothing to do with the hurricane.
Right.
To pump this out and protect the low-lying.
Which is what New Orleans should have done, but their generators went out during Katrina.
And they see, these places have terrible problems. When I lived, and it's hard to imagine if you don't live there. I've never been there. I lived in Orlando for a while, which is where I ran for the United States Congress in 1990. But and I ran as a Democrat just because I was going against a Republican, so it didn't mean much to me because they're both crooks on both sides, so it didn't mean anything. But where I lived in Orlando, in my front yard, we were 12 feet above sea level.
That's pretty low.
Yeah, and again, that was in quite a ways. It was close to Disneyland and all that stuff down there, and you don't realize and how many waterways. What they did many years ago down there. When a contractor went in to build homes, they went in and dug a big hole, connected it to another hole that already had water in it, and sold it as waterfront property. So you have this extraordinary inland canal, inland waterways all the time. I'm surprised that the storms that just went through there wasn't worse.
Good point. Let's take some calls here for you, and then we'll take final calls after the break. Carmine is with us in Post Falls, Idaho, west of the Rockies. Hi, Carmine.
How you doing, George?
Good. Good to have you.
I had to take the call. I took my call. My question for Mr. Fletcher is I'm curious about the perihelion for this item because it's how close they're coming to the sun in millions of miles. And I'm wondering what's effect will be on the sun. Everybody talks about the Earth, but what's it go up there?
I'm sorry, I missed part of that. Could you give that again, or George, can you give me what he said? I didn't hear it.
Go ahead, Carmine. I'll let you explain it.
Repeat that again for a second, Carmine.
Sure. I'm wondering what the perihelion, the closest approach to the sun it will be for this object, because everybody talks about the effects on the Earth, but I was wondering what it'll do to the sun.
Well, as a matter of fact, my feeling is that because of what's been going on in the last 2 years, which is when all of the storms have changed, all of the increase of it, all these other radical things going on, including the number of earthquakes and the numbers of meteoric showers we're having, etc., and the existing of and increasing in size of many of the solar flares and the holes developing on the surface of the sun, my feeling is that it is already affecting the sun.
Probably is.
And utilizing, again, just to use it as why I say that is because of the increase in the flares, the quantity, the size of them, and the holes that they are now seeing all the time developing on the surface of the sun. And on the moon, we started to have some kind of a strange atmospheric change with a haze that's actually developed around the moon, as a matter of fact, and it's like a salt, kind of a salt type of a saline haze that's developing around the moon. So that's kind of strange.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, next call, Linda in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Go ahead, Linda.
Hi, George. Mr.
Hi.
Fletcher. I was saying my prayers in the mid-'90s, and I was standing beside my bed, and I had this vision or OBE of being in space with these magnificent colors, and I could see the Earth, the definition of the planets, and the oceans, and all of a sudden there was this huge ball, a comet or something that was flying past the East Coast, and it was going so fast I could not believe it, because when you think of something going in seconds from the top of the coast to below, it was just amazing. And it had debris, and it was just so clear in my head, and I still see this today.
You're saying it was as like a vision?
Yes, and listen, this was before I started listening to Coast. I didn't listen to Coast until the 90s or the early 2000s, so I had no idea of any of this, but I was just amazed that it came so suddenly, and it was so vivid, and the colors I still see today.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not qualified to make judgment on a person having a vision, but you sounds potentially like you did envision something you might see like Nibiru. That certainly would be fairly close to it. I couldn't make a judgment on that, and it's possible you had some sort of an advanced vision of something like Nibiru. It certainly will be coming fast, and even though it is reported to have this huge elliptical orbit. Now, another point that people ask about, I'm not, and nobody's really positive about the trajectory, and by that I mean it's very likely not on our line of the elliptic that our own planetary orbiting space. That's somewhat of a flat plane called the plane of the ecliptic, which is all the planets, give or take a few 100 million miles, I guess, are on that plane. It could be as much as 30, 40, 50 degrees off of that plane, meaning it would doing a huge, long, outgoing orbit, but also doing it coming in, where it would be coming in like up from the basement or down from the attic, if you will. If you put your arm out to the right of your body, it's perpendicular, that would represent our normal planetary plane where most everything is orbiting the sun. But if you go down about 45 degrees and drop your hand down 18 inches, that would indicate where it potentially may be actually orbiting from a lower or an upper direction. So again, when people say, where can we look to see it? Of course, being infrared, you're not going to easily see it yet. It will not be visible till it's close, reflecting our own sun. And that, again, according to Scripture, is likely going to be started in December. And I guess what I'm also saying with that, as I mentioned earlier, I believe they will have to do martial law prior to...
Yeah, but what's the incident to create martial law, Bob? What will they do?
That's easy. That's very easy the way things are now, right? We may be attacking North Korea next week, all right?
We could.
or that
or this
screwball
week
could initiate something by attacking whatever, any place, our close bases near him, or even South Korea, where he could, with just his regular, the armament that he has just over the mountains from South Korea, he could take out 500,000 people in like 14 minutes without even launching anything other than his own artillery. So that's scary. This is a problem that Trump has. He has to figure out and use one of about 3 of the extraordinary high-tech, top-secret weapons that we do have. One being an electromagnetic missile that travels very quickly at a fairly low elevation, can pass one time over North Korea's primary cities and do the equivalent of a solar flare and shut and burn every electronic device in North Korea.
Just like that. We're coming back with final calls in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you, our final segment with Bob Fletcher. On our next program, by the way, we're going to talk about the possibility of nuclear terrorism. And then Sally Quinn joins us, a writer for the Washington Post at the time, where she has written a book about spirituality, but it's unbelievable how she's put curses on some people. She's going to talk about it, and some of them have died. That's kind of scary stuff, Bob Fletcher, isn't it?
Sure is. That would be spooky. It reminds me of my ex-mother-in-law. She could do it. That's for sure. Anyhow, yeah, there are several areas around the globe that really believe in that. So
yeah.
And I'm certainly not one to judge it. That's for sure. I got enough problems with the globe flying apart beneath our feet.
I know that. Unbelievable. Are you totally convinced that there's a Planet X Nibiru out there, or could you be wrong?
Well, I could be wrong. I used to say when I first put out the DVD incoming, I always preface it saying that I hope I'm wrong, but the bottom line is I'm really positive. I would never, I don't do what I would call like extraordinary investigations. I've been strictly doing straight government corruption, the relationship to it, to problems and what have you, and on that side of the coin. But I was about 95% absolutely sure that we do have the returning of some unknown planetary problem before I completed the DVD. And of course, I went into the religious aspects, and see, they're all aware of it, and all the nation leaders of the major nations of the world are all involved with preparation that fits that, including the Pope, and his conversations of the late and all that. I'm sure that it's real. It's just a matter of exactly when it's happening, and I think when we see them come up with any one of about 6 real easy reasons to declare martial law. Now, they can say it's temporary or whatever, but if they do it on the basis of ISIS and crazy attacks from them, they do it because of Korea, they do it because of disease or any of those things, or even just weather, things going, so many storms or so many problems in so many areas that they can claim the necessity for martial law before any December, whether it's this December or next December.
Good point.
Then I would say that's a red flag. We better be concerned with it.
All right, back to the calls in our final segment. We go to Cornelius in Alexandria, Louisiana. Bob, you're in for a treat here. Hi,
Good.
Cornelius.
Yes, I'm the God, guns, and gold man, the Bible, bullets, and beans man, telling everybody to get ready there. Mr. Bob Fletcher and Mr. George Noory and our great man, Tommy Danheiser.
Told you were in for a treat, Bob.
That's good. I need that.
Go ahead, Cornelius.
Yeah, George. Now, we won't put no voodoo curse on you, George. We're going to bless you.
That's right. You're here to protect me, Corny.
Yeah, Corny. But, Bob, I listened to you on the best of. I was just telling Tommy, I had a best of show Sunday from 9 to 12, and you was on there. I was praying that you would get on this week before the 23rd. So my question for you, Bob, is this. There's a show called Salvation on CBS.
It's
and
great.
The premise is that an incoming asteroid or planet is coming toward Earth. And they've built a Noah's Ark, too, where 200 people can be saved. But the premise is, too, that Russia and the U.S. are getting into a nuclear war to cover up what's coming in. So what do you think about that? And I'll take my answer off the air.
Okay, good, Cornelius. Thanks for your call. And the call was better than your introduction. That show is called Salvation. He's talking about, and it's one of the few programs that I really have been following. I don't have a lot of time for what I call miscellaneous entertainment any longer. I'm getting too old for most of it. But the bottom line is, that's a pretty good show, and they're copying an awful lot of, I think, some of the personalities in it is copying the fellow that heads up the space program that's called SpaceX, and has,
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk. It's absolutely his story on the show Salvation. If you want to be entertained and you're interested in this stuff, look that show up. As a matter of fact, I believe it's on tonight, or was on tonight. The show covers an awful lot of what basically he's been doing there with the SpaceX program. And by the way, he is seriously, right now, presently underway with putting together the plan to move 1 million people to Mars. And it's not a joke. And it's completely something that he's into now for at least maybe a couple of years. And it's very serious. It's straight up and down. So whatever. That's it. I agree with this gentleman. That's a heck of a show because it's very close to reality. And we never know. Our government has been keeping us in the dark on so many things for so many years now. We are so much farther ahead in terms of space activities and weapons that when the people get a good understanding of some of these things that have been going on, they're going to be shocked. And it's just way much farther than you think. They basically have told us nothing for years. They had taken NASA and turned it into some kind of like a magician telling you to watch his right hand while he picks your pocket with his left hand. That's what they've been doing with NASA, because they have privatized for many years, privatized unbelievable programs for outer space activities, et cetera, and weapons. And they have done it the same as the atomic bomb, when they broke it down into a lot of private companies, and nobody in the 40s knew the atomic bomb was underway, and even the vice president at that time did not know about it until we, I think 2 days before we blew it off in Japan. That was the first time the vice president knew about it. So that's what they've been doing, and that show is Salvation. Put it on your automatic record because it's an interesting program. Although I think tonight was the last for the season.
Last episode for the season.
Something like that. I want to let everybody know, for my friends that are not computer savvy, so to speak, yeah. I want to give you a mailing address if you want to grab a pencil and paper.
Well, what's a mailing address, Bob?
Well, I have an address. Obviously, people that are not on the computer, the address wouldn't do them any good unless they knew it. If they want to drop me a note, and I will send them a catalog of what we got going or whatever we're doing. People write notes these days? Like a lot of them, believe it or not. And I was surprised. So anyhow, you can write me if you want to drop me a note. You can write me at Bob Fletcher, and it's Post Office Box 216, Bayview, Idaho. That's 216, Bayview, Idaho, 83803, and I think the last time I was on, we got 100 letters. So
beautiful.
Yeah,
I'll have you give that out one more time before we're off the air here.
It's Box 216, Bayview, Idaho, 83803. For you guys that don't want to function on a computer, or you're not on a computer, drop me a note if you wish, and you can do it at that address.
Let's go to Max in Junction, Texas, east of the Rockies. Max, go ahead.
Hey there, George and Bob. Big fan of both of y'all, and big fan of David Bowie, Ashes to Ashes.
Thank you, Max.
Did you know, George, I love your music. Did you know that Lee Hazelwood, you know that song you always play, Some Velvet Morning?
Some Velvet Morning.
That's Mark Hazelwood's dad, the one that wrote
That's right. You're absolutely right.
And then Nibiru is referred to in Scooby-Doo cartoons 2 or 3 times. It's pretty interesting.
You're right. You're right on.
Show.
You got it.
I love your show, and keep up the great work, you guys. Okay. And love will prevail.
All right. You got that right.
It's interesting. You get a kick to know that when I was the promotion director for MCA, of course, I handled the promotions for all their stars, and it included introducing Elton John to the United States. I was on the road with The Who, and, of course, Loretta Lynn, Conway Twitty, and all the country western performers and all of those old guys. I even blew me away. I did an entire tour in the Southeast USA with Bill Haley and the Comets on a rock and roll revival program. And, of course, Bill Haley, when I was playing drums in my own rock and roll group as a teenager, he was my idol on the black and white screen, and I ended up doing his rock revival show in the 70s, and that was a big kick. But I had handled promotion for some of the greatest stars in the world, I guess, at one time or another there. That was an interesting part of my life when I was a 28-year-old record executive.
Seems like yesterday, doesn't it, Bob?
Oh, gosh. I wish it was, but it's a long time at this point in time. Now I'm going to be I'll be 80 in a couple of years.
Oh, good for you. Let's go to first-time caller Bernard in Carville, Louisiana. Welcome to the show. Hi, Bernard.
Hey, people. How y'all do?
Good, sir. Good.
I have this thing I've been wanting to ask somebody about, and maybe this Bob can help me.
All right.
I was at work one morning, to work on a golf course, and that was like look at the sky and all the chemtrails and stuff. I have a 2-part question. And this jet was following like a shadow in front of it, like almost like a highway. And then I thought it was like, I couldn't figure it out, but then I could look far ahead where the shadow was rolling out, and it made a curve. And I watched, and the jet got to that point, and it made a curve with it, just like somebody on a highway.
Yeah.
I want to know about that. Then the second part is like when we down here, when I used to get a lot of, I can't watch the sky no more because I retired, but we should get a lot of chemtrails for 2 or 3 days. 2 or 3 days later, we're going to get a lot of rain.
Yep, that happens. Well, first of all, in terms of the following of the other plane, normally we think they're by themselves, these chemtrail jets. But sometimes I would assume, Bob, that they are followed or they have protection. What do you think?
I'll tell you what, something I'm not going to talk about at all tonight, but I've been working for a year and a half on my next DVD, which will be my last DVD expose, and it will literally end up being historic, and it is that heavy. It's the greatest thing I've ever put together, and I'm not saying that braggadocious. It's just the way it is and what it is. But we'll answer some of the questions that you're asking right now.
And does it bring rain?
Well, and I'm not sure. Something, and again, I hate to talk about things I'm not positive or don't know an awful lot about, but the chemtrails, there's a combination of application on those things, I'm afraid. And I certainly think that it could be, some of them are upper atmospheric assistance in some weather modification programs. I would say yes. As we had people got carried away with them a couple of years ago, talking about how they'd see a chemtrail at 25,000 feet and 2 days later their chickens would die. I don't think that's the case, and I don't think anybody's out intentionally killing people's chickens. But I don't know enough about chemtrails to really feel that I could even give a good answer. But other than I would absolutely think that in some cases the chemtrails themselves might be involved with some type of experiments in the upper atmosphere, sure.
Jonathan is driving in Louisiana. Lots of Louisiana calls tonight. John, go ahead.
Hey, guys.
You there?
Hello?
Yep, I think we got you.
This little town has probably got some bad reception.
Yeah.
So, I just want to say I've got a great show going on, and I was wanting to know if you can see Nibiru when the time comes, sometime in December, whether it be this year or next year. What kind of magnification of telescope would you need to see it?
Well, I'll tell you, unfortunately, if you just took a basic, inexpensive one, when it starts to become visible, which again, historically it's been in December, and then what it does is actually gets bigger and brighter as it comes closer towards going around the sun. So at one point in time, as it comes in, you're not even going to need a telescope. It's just going to actually look like another star in the sky, and then progressively it will be in the same spot, but getting larger and larger.
Will it get as big as the sun, Bob, in terms of visualization?
Well, again, the old scriptures and all of that indicated that you could see it in the night sky like a star, and it would progressively get larger, obviously. When it starts during the daytime, you can't see stars, so you're not going to see it during the day, and you don't want to look at the sun anyhow. But as it progressively gets closer at night, every night you will see it every week, let's say, it will get bigger and bigger, so eventually you will not even need a telescope. But when it starts to be visible, you could probably see it with a cheap telescope. The bad guys that have the ability to see it, maybe today, we can't see it at all. It's way, way, way out there. And again, the best way to know if it's going to be approaching is when they do that martial law. They cannot.
All right, we will look for that. We're out of time. Bob Fletcher, website linked up at coasttocoastam.com. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladouceur, Greg Bishop, Stephanie Smith, Chris Borelson, George Knapp. I'm George Noory, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.